How's that? How you doing, folks? I'm Doc Schweitzer, and I think we're going to have a pretty interesting little discussion here with my really good friend, Luis Miranda. And first of all, I want to thank Steve for sponsoring this, giving money to the foundation, and what he's selling, the idea of buying time in sports, is spectacular because you have full attention and you don't have people clicking through. So please talk to Steve and learn a little bit about what he's selling. So I have a terrific honor to introduce my friend Luis Miranda, and I'm just going to let him talk a bit, but real quick, a quick announcement. He will be feted tonight at the dinner. There will be dinner, and there will be wine and beer, okay? Okay, so please come tonight. He's getting a major award. I think it's the, from the Christmas story, that lamp, the lamp light. I think you're getting one of those. So Luis is a political consultant, one of the best. He's out of New York City. He's worked for Chuck Schumer and Hillary Clinton. He's been very charitable in his life and boards. He has done an enormous amount of work to help the people of Puerto Rico, raising an enormous amount of money for them and helping them. He's the subject of a terrific documentary. If you haven't seen it, Siempre Luis. It's a fabulous documentary. But seriously, the most important thing is he's given us a great gift, which is his son, Lin-Manuel Miranda. So I'm going to just open this up because I think Hamilton was singularly the greatest campaign I've ever seen in my life. And I saw his hands and handwriting all over the campaign. And when he first told me about the play, he said his son read Turnout's book on Hamilton. I fell asleep when I read it. His son turned it into the greatest musical in the history of musicals. So Luis, can you tell us a little bit about campaigns and Hamilton, and take it?
Thank you, thank you. I'll try to talk. Please keep eating. I always remember first. We always associated Hamilton with the Obama administration. Lin-Manuel had written one song, My Shot, and Obama had just won. David Axelrod called me and said the First Lady wants to put together nights of music and poems, and Lin-Manuel had just gotten the Tony for In the Heights. Can he do a number from In the Heights? I told Lin-Manuel, and then he said, well, you think that I could do something new? I wrote this song from the Hamilton book. As a good dad, I said, coño, they asked you to go to a goddamn White House to sing a song from In the Heights that already got a Tony, and you need to experiment with something. Why don't we go with the song that already won? Then I passed on the contact. Needless to say, he sang the new song from Hamilton, not from In the Heights. And you actually can Google it. You could see the president and the first lady and the first family sort of being totally immersed in Hamilton. And that's the first song that was written. And later on in one of the workshops, the main producer came over and said to me, you understand, the only way someone can write this musical, it's someone who was in lots of rooms where shit is happening. And I have never thought about it that way. But yeah, he grew up in a political family. He was doing homework or playing while a lot of stuff was happening around him, and Hamilton is born.
Did you give him the book? I mean, he's at the beach and he calls
I did, Rick. Lin-Manuel came over. He had a vacation from In the Heights. He was on stage doing In the Heights. And he came back and said, Dad, I know what my next musical is going to be about. I just read Ron's book. And as I'm reading it, hip hop, it's jumping from the pages. I'm like, a book about Hamilton and hip hop is jumping from the pages. 2 days later, that's when there were bookstores. I went to the bookstore, bought the book. I was going to LA and sort of read the book. I figure if this is what's going to happen in our lives for the next couple of years, I may as well read the book and get a sense of the ride that we're going to be in. I was really fascinated by the book. But Lin-Manuel reads something and see things that us normals don't see.
But it puts a spotlight on immigrants, and that's in many part, came from Puerto Rico to New York to become a political consultant. I mean your road has been terrific to do this, but it's America's story.
Yeah, no, he said when he read the book, a couple of things jumped at him. One was how the founding fathers had beef with each other. They were constantly fighting with each other under other names. Everybody had a newspaper to publish their own shit. And he said, and that's what rappers do. When you see the rap community, they have beef with each other. And they use the writing to express that beef. That's what the founding fathers did. I sort of never looked at the founding fathers that way, but he did. And sort of the beginning, and then the second thing was that Hamilton was the only one who was not from here, who had come from somewhere else. And actually, his story, it's interesting because he comes to New York to study after a hurricane destroys Nevin. And there is a collection that it's made, and he's sent to study in the States. So he always said that reminds him a lot about my story of sort of coming to New York to study. I always planned to go back to Puerto Rico. I never thought I would stay in New York, but then life gets complicated. I fell in love, I got married and stayed. Every year I was going back, and 49 years have passed since that.
In the rollout of Hamilton, and like I said, I thought it was the greatest campaign. What are some of the things like social media and everything that you used? Because you had to be as familiar with it as anybody.
What I have learned as I shift my work from the political work that I did most of my life to now where I'm actually managing, about to manage 2 new movies that are coming in November, Tic Tic Boom and Encanto. It's the same principles. You saw the info, so that's the same info that I use to work with Netflix and the metrics to figure out where are we going to advertise, what are the themes that a particular movie is gonna take, and treat it like a campaign. I always remember when Lin-Manuel was nominated for the Tonys, that the producer said to me, "You're going to do this. You're going to run it like you would run a campaign. The difference is that there's 1,000 voters. And we need to convince a chunk of those voters that your son deserves this award." And we treated the campaign like any of us will treat any campaign. The Oscars are no different, the Emmys are no different. And so it has been very, very easy to look at this other side, since it's exactly what we all do on the political side, but on the art side.
What are the two movies? Because everything he does is golden. So what are the two movies coming up?
He has Jonathan Larson wrote Rent and died actually before the actual opening. And he wrote a musical that is not very well known, Tick, Tick, Boom. And it's his directorial debut, and that will open now in November. And then Disney's 60th animated film. It's about a Colombian family, and it opens, it's a Thanksgiving Disney release called Encanto.
Well, Luis, one of the things that I most admire about you is your charitable contributions, not only in New York and many boards and everything, but your incredible commitment to the people of Puerto Rico after the storm. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that and sort of the challenges they have today. And I think you raised somewhere around $20 million for the people.
44. Who's counting?
Yeah, who's counting? $44 million.
And 15 for the arts.
Another 50 for the arts.
Separate pot of money.
Could talk a little bit about Puerto Rico and the struggles and what's going on.
Well, you know, Puerto Rico is a colony. It's a territory of the United States. And when you start with that, problems increase. Because no decision, no real decision, it's actually made in Puerto Rico. Of course, you make the decisions at what time do you pick up the garbage, or at what time offices open, and all of the normal things. But the important decisions are made in Congress. And Puerto Rico follows all of the laws, but has no representation. So at the end of the day, that makes life more difficult. Puerto Rico was hit when Trump was the president. We haven't had a cruelest person, probably since Andrew Jackson, in the White House. And he just stopped aid. Puerto Rico, as Trump realized, because he said it several times, it's an island. It has water around. So when the hurricane hit, because we were not there, we had to get there. It's not Texas, where you could go through the states around. It's an island, and he said it publicly. You know, we weren't there because they're an island. You asshole, of course, he has been an island all along. And so aid came in late, and then he just picked a beef with the local government and decided that he was stopping aid that Congress had appropriated at every step of the way. In fact, the first aid that Puerto Rico got, real aid, happened when he lost the election. And it was 20-something billion that Congress had appropriated. So the recovery has been slow. Everything sort of put together with saliva. You know, the electric grid, it's put together with a little bit of saliva here, and you make electricity go here. So now it has collapsed. A new company took over the electrical grid, and every day they will lose electricity. And just think about it. My family didn't have electricity right after Maria for 6 months. My sister said to me, I learned how to make coffee in the grill every morning. So you invent, you create new things, but it continues to be challenging, but it's open for business, and they're doing their best to make sure that when people go, they get first-rate treatment, since that's one of the main sources of income for the island.
Luis, I personally am going to give you a check for people of Puerto Rico, but we have
Thank you.
Another gift from the AAPC, and our president, Becky Donatelli, is going to present it to you.
I didn't know I was going to get presents.
Yeah.
That's great. I love presents.
And I do believe that Republican governor of Florida did what he could to help you guys out, too.
He went to the island many times for photo ops.
So I can't imagine anyone better to make this announcement than you. Would you read this to the group?
Oh my God. Directly from the governor of Florida. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the AAPC, I am pleased to announce that the 2022 Polly Awards and Conference will take place on May 17th to 19th, so write it down, in San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico, ready to celebrate.
So, I will see you all. I will see you tonight, but then I will see you on May 17th in San Juan, Puerto Rico. We'll have a great time. We'll have beer, but for sure we'll have rum. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Miranda, I have to say I'm a huge fan. If you haven't watched the documentary, you need to. It is fantastic. You are a trailblazer, and on behalf of every political consultant, but especially one who's a Latina, thank you for blazing the trail for me. So we get to talk about how vote by mail changes campaigns, and I want to welcome up my panelists. We have Secretary of State from the state of Washington, Kim Wyman. And as a point of personal privilege, she is a Gonzaga alumni parent. And I am a Gonzaga alum. So we did tease that we might talk a little March Madness. We have Jason Thielman, who is the Chief of Staff to Montana U.S. Senator Steve Daines. Jill Nelson Golub, who is a partner at BMWL Campaigns. And Joshua Ulibarri, who is a partner at Lake Research Partners. Please welcome our panelists today. Welcome, welcome. So I will say that, a lot of things changed in 2020, but certainly one of the things that did change dramatically and kept many of us political consultants on our toes was how voters are actually going to cast their ballot during a pandemic. And some of these rules changed midway through the game. Some of the times the primaries date changed, and so reallocation of budgets. These are all things we lived through, and horror stories I'm sure we will share this evening over wine and beer for sure. But one of the things that I noticed in my own family was, the moment that we get our ballots in the mail, it feels like there's some anxiety in the house, like, when are we filling these out? When does this happen? And so I think, I like to think of, the thought of, instead of writing down, here is the list of things you need to vote for, take it to the polling place, it's more of sitting in your living room with your family and really discussing the issues and saying, are we voting yes on this, no on this, yes for this candidate, no on that candidate, dad fighting me, why aren't we voting for this guy over this judge or whatever. It is a different, type of interaction that we have with the voters. And so, one of the questions that I have, for Washington State has been doing this for a while, and in fact, I was once upon a time a Washington State voter, and I believe I did vote by mail during that time. But Secretary Wyman, you helped transition a county to this process of all vote by mail, and then you became the Secretary of State and have been overseeing, these type of elections for, about a decade now. From your experience, what are some of the impacts that you've seen on participation and turnout?
Oh, I've seen a lot. Now I have a PowerPoint I didn't tell you about.
Go for it.
Okay.
Let's do the PowerPoint.
Zach's got to stick together,
Cue the
right?
slides.
Okay, cue the slides. So yesterday there was a panel on election law, and the question that never got answered in that panel was, how long is vote by mail going to stick around? Are we going to see this? And I don't think anyone answered it, but I have the answer for you. So the answer is look to the past. So hopefully, if we can get this to work. Okay, I might not have a vote by mail. There we go. This is a map of the country in 1919, and this is representation of women voting before the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. And you'll notice the states in white gave women suffrage. They could vote in any election. Some states gave primary options and presidential options, and the states in black did not allow women to vote at all. And if you look at the modern day map, that hopefully will come up. There we go. You'll see a lot of commonality. And I say this to all of you who are looking forward. Now, I can't tell you what time frame this is going to happen, but voting by mail and absentee ballots are going to be part of your future for many years to come, and it's going to increase, and it's going to move from west to east. And let's just get a real quick poll in here, because I know y'all love this. How many of you have voted at a polling place election in the last 3 years? Raise your hands. Okay, forget it then. Stupid policy people or political people. Okay. My point is, for the average voter, convenience is really the king. And most people do not have the ability to go to their polling place on election day during a specific time because they work a swing shift or they have kids that play soccer. There's a million reasons why. So early voting and vote by mail are the way that people can vote when it's convenient for them. And what we saw in Washington is we evolved from 1993 to about 2005 towards vote by mail when we gave people the option to vote as a permanent absentee voter, getting a vote by mail ballot every election. By 1996, we were seeing 90% turnout by mail in local elections, special elections, and we saw a phenomenon in 96 that was very unpleasant for me. We had our first levy failures for school districts, and I remember sitting in a very heated meeting with school district directors who had this great method of winning elections. Sneak an election through in a special election in February where you have low turnout, Only do GOTV to your supporters, pass a levy with 70% or more. Good plan. Until you start putting a ballot in every household in that district, and now all of a sudden, you're failing levies. And so it really was a moment where I started to understand the impact on campaigns. So the takeaway I want you all to have is vote by mail is here to stay, and absentee voting is here to stay. And different groups of people like it, different groups of people hate it. Not mentioning the president at all. And what's really important is that it changes campaigns dramatically. You all know that from your experience last year. They are longer and they are more expensive, and getting out the vote is a very different animal than peaking to a single election day. So Washington State did not do this overnight. It really, the pivotal moment came in 2004 when we had the closest governor's race in the country's history. 2.8 million ballots cast. I'm going to stop with my slides because I can't get them to work. 2.8 million ballots cast after 2 statewide recounts and a 6-month court case. The winner won by 133 votes. I do not recommend it. Any of you who were there or have been through it know what I'm talking about. But what it did is it really put a focus on our inability to run a polling place election simultaneously with a vote-by-mail election. So our legislature in 2005 gave our counties the option to move to vote by mail. 37, I think, of the 39 counties moved that year. It took our 2 biggest counties, Pierce and King counties, Seattle and Tacoma, another 5 years to ramp up. So we've been completely vote by mail since 2011, and I have some really cool graphics, but, oh, here we go. First and foremost, we had incredible voter engagement. You all know that. We had 90% of our eligible voters were registered last year, and we had 84% turnout. We were 5th in the country. Not that I'm competitive, but I wish I was first, but we did well. Some of the things, though, that I think are lessons learned from Washington. First and foremost, we started a ballot box program where we have permanent drop boxes across our state. It really started in my county about 20 years ago, and it has branched out, and you'll notice that by about 2016, over half of the ballots were returned in ballot drop boxes. Now, our legislature in 2018 passed legislation to do prepaid postage for all the return envelopes. We did see a dip, but it peaked in 2020, and you can see that 73% of our ballots that were returned by ballot drop boxes. Another phenomenon that we saw in 2020 that was remarkable to me, and in all the years I've done this, I've never seen this. Typically in Washington State, half of our ballots come in by the Friday before Election Day. We have an 18-day pre-election day voting period. This year, 80% of our ballots came in by Friday. Unprecedented. Now, Washington has a postmarks requirement, so as long as you have a postmark of Election Day or before, your ballot will count. So we see ballots that trickle in on Wednesday that are valid, and you can see that number on the 4th of November. Quite a few ballots came in, but it does change your campaigns, and I think a typical year we see a real spike when ballots go out at the 18-day window, and then it drops off, and we're seeing about 2 to 5% a day coming back of the total that will come in, and then the spike is that weekend before Election Day. The other thing that I think is really important to get on your radar in terms of your plans for your campaigns is you want to make sure that you are thinking about why ballots could be rejected. In our state, we have a very low rejection rate, 1% of the ballots. It was less than that in 2020. And these, I don't know how well you can read the graphic, but the blue is late postmarks. So these are voters that get their ballot in the mail after it's postmarked. And in most elections, that makes up, a good portion of the ballots that get rejected. Signatures not matching is the place where you all should have a plan. Because most states now, like ours, have what you guys call the chase. Where you can get a list of people whose ballots are being held because they forgot to sign or their signature didn't match. Our counties are required to reach out to those voters and give them a second chance, but campaigns typically will be using that to do their daily returns. Also, you can, in most states, at least I hope, I know in my state, you can get a list of who's returned a ballot every day. And so in terms of a longer campaign, yes, you're spending more money, but now you can target those voters who are still out there that are waiting to cast their ballot, and you can really dial in your message. The downside for you, of course, is late attacks on candidates aren't as effective because voters have probably voted by the time you're doing those hit pieces. But again, it changes your strategy. You can't just build to a single day. If you want more data on Washington state elections, we do an annual report. And I would really encourage you to go to the Secretary of State's webpage and look at that, because I think you can learn a lot about where the rest of the country is going to be going in the next 5 to 10 years. They will be following Washington and Oregon. And another place that I would encourage you to go to is the National Vote at Home Institute. This is a nonprofit organization devoted to policy changes to make more states vote by mail states. But I will tell you, a lot of the research they have is very relevant to what you do and would be probably helpful in your strategizing. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And to your point of states following your lead, I mean, California just passed the law that, for COVID reasons, they had every person getting a ballot, and now that's going to be law of the land. So anyone doing work in California, check out her website for some great tips. But I did, you showed the slide with the bar graphs of challenges, right, with signatures and the missing things. Your office does a great job around educating voters and continue that education. It's not just assume that once somebody votes by mail, they'll know what to do for the rest of their time as a voter. What are some things that your office has been doing around outreach and continued education?
One of the things that's nice about Washington State is we have a general election pamphlet. Although I'm saying this to people who make money off of campaigning, we send a voter's pamphlet every general election, actually now by state law in every election, to every household in the state. And this is, candidates get to access this and put in a statement, pro and con statements for issues, and it's all no cost. And we use that as one of our biggest platforms for getting information to voters. But I think we also spend a lot of time working with advocacy groups, campaigns, all of those people that are touching voters directly, and making sure they understand our laws and how it works in Washington State. I think the vote by mail, the election law panel we had yesterday, that group did a really good job of talking about the importance of understanding the difference between states in terms of absentee voting and vote by mail. I mean, we still have states in this country who you not only have to have an excuse, but you have to have a specific excuse. My West Coast mindset doesn't understand that, but you need to know that as a campaign, or you're going to get crosswise if you do some sort of mailer to your potential voters trying to get them to sign up for absentee ballots and they're not able to. So I would say, really work with your local election officials and work with your secretaries of state or your statewide election officials.
Great, thank you. And I want to kick it over to Josh, because one of the things that comes up and trusted sources, right, and you shared with us some trusted sources, but trust in the process and government is a challenge for both sides of the aisle. And you've seen in research, particularly in communities of color and some of the groups that you have worked with, is that there is certainly some mistrust and built in within government. What are some challenges that you've identified and ways that you've helped practitioners, one, that they should be aware of, but two, ways to navigate their way out of that trust issue?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, and awesome. I really appreciate not only following Mr. Miranda, but now the Secretary of State. So you've really set us up well over here. Thank you. So I appreciate the question, because I think as practitioners, what we should, and I know we already know this, but there's a difference between early vote and vote by mail. And I'll just say this too as well. If my hometown newspaper, the Salt Lake Tribune, on its website today, the leading article is "How long will vote by mail last in Utah?" So if it's here, I hope it's here to stay. We're going to find out in the next couple of years. But there's a difference between vote early and vote by mail, right? And there's a long history in many states of vote early, right? Less of a history voting by mail. And as we think about sort of persuasion tactics and we think about get out the vote tactics, very different audiences for us. And the point I want to make is last year we moved a lot of voters to vote by mail across the country. And as a Democrat, we moved a lot of southern states to vote by mail where they had vote early, right? Souls to the polls, that kind of conversation, but not as much experience with vote by mail. And we had a lot of debates in the states we were working for in the South in terms of how to talk about vote by mail. Because for all sorts of reasons, systemic racism built into the system, But for sure, we know that ballots in higher performing African American districts have a higher return of rejected ballots, more spoiled ballots, vote by mail. And so, as we think about, as Democratic practitioners, moving people to vote by mail, there's an education process we have to have as well, not just about voting early, but about voting by mail. Signatures, those kinds of things the Secretary of State spoke about. And we had real debates about sort of, do we encourage people to vote by mail? We also have within, because our base is, a lot of people of color, less familiarity with vote by mail, vote early, again, a different world, a lot of distrust in the system among black voters, Latino voters, that is my ballot going to be counted because of, what they believe is discrimination in the system. And so as we think about moving voters from voting early to voting by mail, there's more education we have to do, especially, I think, on our side of the discussion in terms of activating our base vote and making sure they're comfortable and knowledgeable about how to do that. And so lots of debates last year about how to do that. In fact, we had some practitioners say we should not be moving people to mail. And I'm like, folks, we're in a pandemic. We're going to be spending millions of dollars moving to people to mail. You better figure out a strategy to educate our vote in terms of vote by mail. So one is just education and a different effort voting by mail versus voting early. And the second thing I'll say too is what the Secretary said is we have this experience right now in Virginia where Virginia liberalized voting laws, a lot more vote early, a lot more vote by mail, and we have this whole discussion about signatures and which signatures are legit and not, and how long a secure process and the chase process. So I think as practitioners we need to think about transitioning people from from voting early to vote by mail, and what it means both for persuasion and what it means for turnout, often two different kinds of conversations.
Absolutely. Others want to chime in on this issue because I know it's something that we all deal with as practitioners on how to really, get folks to trust in and opt in on the process, and any experiences, both Jason and Jill, that you have on this topic.
It, oddly enough, isn't just Democrat constituencies that have some hesitation and trust issues related to vote by mail. In Montana, in our Senate race, in the 2020 Senate races, for example, the governor, who was also a candidate on the ballot at the time, gave each county the choice of adopting vote by mail or not adopting vote by mail. And 10 counties of the 56 counties opted not to do so, and those were not unpredictably very conservative Republican counties where there was a tremendous amount of hesitation and distrust within the vote by mail system. But even outside of that, in Montana, we had moved to no-fault absentee voting in the late 1990s, and much of the state, more than 2/3, 3/4 of the state prior to even the 2020 election chose to vote by mail, but those that did not were overwhelmingly Republican. So you were always losing the election dramatically in the initial returns, and people are, on my side of the aisle anyway, extremely nervous and frightened, but you're winning 80% of the vote with those that are choosing to vote on election day. And even when we saw counties opt to go to vote by mail, we had a massive number of people that refused to do so and wanted to walk those ballots in. But the lack of trust in the system, I think, is something that's growing, as it is with all of our institutions, and I think will be an increasing challenge with vote by mail and election process overall. So I think it's the election administrator's prayer, Secretary Wyman, I don't care who wins, just don't let it be close.
In California, it's obviously a little different, similar, right? So the majority of California voters have been voting by mail for over a decade. And the way it used to be was that we had similar spikes, right? So there was the group of people who would return their ballots right away. Those were always older, more conservative voters. And then sort of younger, more progressive voters that came out on election day or returned their ballot on election day, which is the most frustrating, right? Because those are the longest to count. So you're on the first count on election night, you're losing, right? But you're gaining over time. But then it's like 2, 3, 4 weeks, right, before you're winning an election, which is
It's election month in California.
oh my God,
I'm sure it is
so
in Washington,
stressful.
so.
You're waiting every day for the count to come out. But what we've seen actually from the transition to all vote by mail is that's really scattered that. We still are seeing earlier, right, more conservative, but the waiting till election day didn't really happen, at least locally, in the last election. It was a very special election where people were very motivated to vote. Everyone was home. Everyone read their ballot books, right? There was a lot of people getting together and voting together. So it did sort of disrupt the patterns, but I think, at least in California, there's less distrust of the vote-by-mail system because it's been around for so long. In some parts, then you get to add ranked choice voting vote by mail, which is like a whole nother pile of worms, but that's not what we're talking about. Anyway, so it has changed somewhat, but I don't think we have as much of an issue, at least in the sort of big city areas of the LA area and the Bay Area and Sacramento, of distrust of vote by mail.
Thank you for sharing that. And I want to switch to managing resources, because as we have seen with the spikes, and you just mentioned sort of the time frame that an election occurs, it's no longer 5 days of GOTV, it's 5 weeks of GOTV. Josh, I want to start with you. And how have you seen campaigns adjust their research schedule? And when have you advised campaigns on how to ramp up spending and help help them reach voters when they're making that decision?
Yep, there's and all of these campaigns will be different in terms of how vote by mail and vote early affects message. One of the things the secretary said, right, is that negative campaigning, late negative matters less because so many ballots are in, and so it has really changed our flow of communication, right? I mean, you had a pattern which was build up our candidates positively, run the contrast, run the negative, et cetera, and now you have to introduce. You don't have to introduce, but winning campaigns will introduce negative a lot earlier in the conversations and ramp and sort of ruin our traditional flow of positive, negative, et cetera. So we've had to make some adaptations there. I think I live in Arizona for the last 12 years, and we're 75% Pebble, 80% Pebble, which is permanent early voting list, which is vote by mail essentially. And it changes, honestly, a couple of things when it comes to survey research. And again, each of these races will be different. But as we know, if so much of the vote comes in early, the way you ramp up your communication, your earlier spend and spend down, right? You have less spend in the last 2 weeks because there's less data out there. It matters when you poll, right? When I track, I sort of track I place my trackers on sort of one of three decisions, which is, have you spent half your money? So we've done something to change the dial. We're measuring change. Which of our vendors is going to use that information? If it's mail, you need a longer run, right? So you need an earlier tracker. And if it's digital or television or radio, you can use a shorter run because you can flip the switch the next day on something new. So your tracker can go a little bit later. But vote by mail and earlier vote sort of messes with that timeline again, because when that early vote comes in, you also have to sort of have tracked when that vote's coming in and when you want to place your tracker. So it's very different. It's changed some of our rhythms, both in terms of the communication process, but also when we want to poll. And then the other thing we have to do, of course, is we don't have to do this, but we ask, have you already voted once the ballots are out? And our surveys always come back with more people saying they already voted than actually voted for all sorts of reasons, right? I mean, people think in their head, maybe people have filled out the ballot but haven't sent it in, so it's sitting on their desk, but we know they haven't voted. Maybe people think I've decided in my head, I already know how I'm voting, so I'm going to tell you if I already voted. And other people will tell me they've already voted just to try to get out of my survey. But I got a trick, right? I'll just put you on another path, which tell me how you voted instead of how you're going to vote.
It's like the voter file doesn't lie, people.
So we also have to change in some ways the questions we ask, but it does always help us to figure out people who said they already voted, because we know most of them already haven't voted. So messes up your rhythm a little bit, thinking about where you're going to put that tracker. The higher spending campaigns get more options. They can place more trackers in different places. But the last point I'll make is, again, Arizona, which was, besides the North Carolina markets, right, was ground zero with the presidential, the Senate campaign, the congressionals that were sort of being watched over there. You couldn't buy any inventory in terms of television in the last 2 weeks. And if you could buy it, it was so damn expensive that our propositions we couldn't buy. So essentially, our last track, we stopped tracking not because we didn't care what was going on, it would have been interesting to us, but because we couldn't affect it. We couldn't have placed a new television ad to make a difference. So what the heck are we going to test at that point? And by that point, our last tracker comes out of the field. We know it's heavily Democratic in terms of already voted, because that's what happens. Those are the trends. We tried to model the second half of the vote, right? What does the election day vote look like? And we placed more emphasis the last couple of weeks on the model as opposed to the tracking, because you can't, you couldn't buy in these markets to affect your final ad. So what are we testing anyway?
No, that's a great point. And I think a lot of us have, been in that situation where it's like, pile of money, what to do with it? We can't actually buy anything. And Jason, to this point, in 2020, plans seem to change week to week, right? Resource allocation, money coming from random places. When and you just mentioned about, Montana changing to some counties, having an all vote by mail system, some not. How did the change really affect the plans for, Senator Daines' re-elections campaign? And, talk about the field strategy too, because that was something that a lot of consultants really wrestled with in the pandemic environment, and it seemed to be something that was a real key to Senator Daines' victory as well.
When first campaign I ever ran was a 2004 governor's race in Montana. At that time, 10% of the electorate chose to vote by mail. And I remember when I was first trying to describe to people, what is it, what's a campaign like? What do you do in a campaign? And the best description of what that sort of role is you are building something for a one-day sale. So you are creating your Macy's, your department store, your restaurant that is going to sell cheeseburgers on one day and one day only. So most of your period of time for your one-day sale previously is all marketing. It's all making certain that people know your store is going to open up on one day, that it's the store that has the best cheeseburger at the best price, that's not going to give you heartburn, comes with the coldest beer, that sort of thing. And your staffing side of that, for example, of who you're going to have at the cash register and making certain that you have people to wait the tables, take the orders, so on and so forth, that is a much smaller logistical question that really only involves of all of your budget and all of your time and energy and resources one day, maybe 1%, maybe 0.5% or 1/4% of all of your energy and effort being dedicated towards having resources for that. Now, of course, when we move to you have an 18-day in Washington and Montana, it's 30 days from the election when the ballots are mailed out. You now have to build out that logistical operation for that 30-day period of time. So it really creates, in addition to the obvious importance of changing the messaging from persuasion to get out the vote, the importance of data, knowing who's voted. It fundamentally changes from a World War II carpet bombing campaign to needing a much more modern precision campaign, because you do have a sense, albeit there's some delay, of who hasn't voted and who has and where they're at. You really need to build out a logistical field operation to make certain that for 30 days you are able to service that restaurant and have customers coming in. And it, just as it would be if you were opening a restaurant that only existed for one day and marketing and selling for that, now you're doing it for 30x times that, you are going to have a corresponding difference in how you organize and build out the resources for that campaign. In the pandemic, typically speaking, I think one reason that Democrats tend to prefer all mail-in balloting is they have I think a larger traditional infrastructure of associated and affiliated groups that can fill in the gaps, those resource gaps for having the restaurant and serving people for those 30-day period of time, whereas Republicans tend to have fewer of these outside organizations. In Montana, when that decision was made, for example, many of the national pundits thought that was something that would be a great advantage to our opponent in the race. I don't think it was in large, and for a couple of reasons. One, I think we understood that elections were moving, and the importance of moving from our carpet bombing to having our more precision bombing and building out that logistical infrastructure even before that decision was made in its entirety. But also, I think the Democrat-aligned groups were uncomfortable and uncertain of how to use and deploy their traditional advantages on the ground.
Thank you. And so, Jill, I want to kick it to you because, you do field in a lot of ballot measure and candidate campaigns in the Bay Area where, and Jason, you mentioned this, structure of other sides of the aisle. A lot of the times in California, we're fighting against other Democrats, and it's like, who is the better, definition of what a Democrat is?
And we encourage that.
Welcome to the Bay Area. And so, Jill, tell us about, one, the timeline and engaging voters, in sort of this longer get out the vote, time, but also utilizing the data. I mean, I don't know, for those who do California campaigns, like I have alerts on Paul Mitchell and PDI's, Twitter feed with the, and subscribe to the daily, intake of the ballots. Like that has just become the culture of the campaigns and the way we do things there. And so I wanted to just give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about the tactics that you've been employing in your successful races.
Yeah, that's a lot. So let's break that down. So from a timeline perspective, right? Obviously, election day starts 4 weeks earlier, right? I think everyone gets that. I think that what's important to remember is a couple of things. One is that pushes your whole timeline back, right? So you're starting GOTV 4 weeks out. That means you have to hit your ID goal in order to start GOTVing. Like, we'll continue to do some persuasion once the ballots are live, but you have to have enough resources to get out your vote, right? We're running a small parcel tax campaign right now on the peninsula, and we have hit our ID goal, and like getting everybody to be like, no, we're not doing persuasion anymore. No, we're not doing broadcast communication. We have between, our ID'd vote and our base vote enough vote to win the election. We just need to get them to return their ballot, right? So getting everyone to sort of orient around that is really critical, but that starts with the phasing of the campaign all the way back, right? So your digital, your mail, your field, right? You're doing your awareness earlier, you're doing your conversion earlier, your funnel of engagement all gets moved up, right? So that you can flip the switch on election day, which is now 4 weeks earlier, and start turning people out. And then sort of the most, interesting part that I can talk about forever is the data that you're getting, right? So yeah, we're really lucky in California. We're all, a lot of us use PDI or L2 or other, data providers that are used to this process. But right now in this election we're working on, we're getting data updates 3 times a week. So at 3 times a week, I'm taking the data of who's voted, and I'm figuring out, okay, not only how old are they Republicans or Democrats, are they, progressive, where do they live in the city, but how does that overlap with my outreach universe, right? So am I communicating to the right people? So, this is a school campaign, so we were not really, we removed senior Republicans, right, mostly from our universe. So the first thing we did when the first 2,700 votes came in was to figure out, okay, how many were in our mail universe and our outreach universe? 80%. Great, we did that right. Okay, cool. You get to know right away if you've missed a bucket of votes, right, that you weren't aware of was going to turn out, because we're all, making our best educated guess, especially in a special election. And then, once you figure that out, you can start figuring out, okay, of our ID'd supporters, right, only 30% have returned their ballots. So you're running those numbers every 3 days, right, and you're literally seeing the results of your GOTV work, right, which is so different from that, what you were sort of talking about, which was you do everything on election day and you just kind of cross your fingers and hope that it works, right? I'm seeing okay, we just did a GOTV phone bank and now our numbers are moved, right, 10% or 16%. And you have to be, you sort of are getting the advantage of it's almost like polling every 3 days, right? But you have to be able to be nimble in your campaign strategy to do that. And you have to, my recommendation would be that people really wrap their heads around the data side of it, because I think it's critical.
Absolutely, it's all math at the end of the day.
But math wasn't my strong suit, but I'm getting better.
I always laughing. I'm that one class that they made us take in math is now incredibly important. Did you want to chime in?
I was just going to say, I think, so the more, and sophisticated isn't the right word, but the more experienced states with vote early, vote by mail, California, Arizona, other places that have, Washington, the Pacific North, that have done it more often, I think we can look at that data. We're more experts on, our expertise is more exact in terms of evaluating the states that have more experience, but as other states are coming online, that expertise isn't, it's not as transferable, right? I mean, you can have vendors who work at several states, but I guess my point is, in North Carolina last year, and somewhat in Virginia this year, our sort of returned ballots and our field numbers weren't always matching up in terms, because we didn't know how to interpret it, right? We'd never done that. We'd never been in a pandemic. Well, we had been in a pandemic before, but not in an election season like this. And so I think some of that is just, I don't know, in terms of Democratic side of here, sharing some more of that expertise, because I think when our numbers right now in some of these states don't match up the same way we think that the returns are matching up, and sometimes even the way the model is telling us it's matching up. And so I think there's a break there, because I think our older or more experienced vendors who are sort of sitting in their offices talking about what those numbers look like versus our younger field agents out there turning out the vote, activating people, getting energy up. Those things I think we're getting back to having a little split analysis there for us, at least on our side, and I think we need to spend some time trying to figure out what that means, at least in the new states that are moving vote by mail and to more early vote. I just don't, the expertise isn't catching up with them, and who knows what it's going to look like, but I think that may be a problem for us next year.
Great. I want to touch on one, thing that is, there is a lot of talk around security, and there's a lot of talk about, sort of the rules of the game, and, we're not really here to debate the merits of vote by mail. It sort of is like debating the designated hitter. At some point, the National League is going to adopt it, and we're all going to have to suffer, and, we'll be mad about it. But, we don't get to decide that here. And yes, for the baseball fans in the room, go Dodgers. But we don't get to decide how the rules of the game are played. That is, for another session. But we do decide how we engage with it. And I think one of the things that, we had talked about on our pre-call was how to protect your staff and how to protect your volunteers. And, what are some best practices? And this is a question for everyone, and we can go down the line, is what are some best practices do you believe that every practitioner should know when engaging with voters who have ballots, and there are rules that are different in every single jurisdiction, and things that people think they can get away with because they maybe are just a little too eager as a volunteer? And we'll start with you, Secretary Wyman.
All right, this is the one you all really need to pay attention to. It's become a hot button issue from 2020. It's ballot collection, some call it ballot harvesting, but it's a concept of going, say, door to door in a neighborhood and knocking on the door and saying, hey, I'm here with the Kim Wyman campaign, and I want to make it easier for you to return your ballot. Why don't you just give it to me and I'll turn it in for you? This is the dumbest idea you could ever have in campaigning. Okay, y'all are asleep. This is the dumbest idea your campaign could ever have, and here's why. You're making your campaign vulnerable to attacks that you will not be able to defend against. Because it's the same thing as someone walking up and saying, hey, could you just give me $100? I'll take it to your bank for you. Don't worry, I'll deposit it, it'll be great. You'll be good. No one would do that to a stranger. And yet, I know campaigns are out there in the field doing this work or having a drop box in their, campaign headquarters, whatever it is. The problem is you're now taking custody of that voter's ballot. And unless you are giving them some sort of receipt or keeping track of all the ones you're collecting, all it's going to take is an organized campaign against your campaign that says, well, my family is a bunch of Democrats, and they know the Kim Wyman campaign is Republican, and they know we're not going to vote for her, so they threw away our ballots. And now my campaign has no recourse to prove that we never took custody of their ballot. It's just a bad idea, and we're starting to see, we saw it in North Carolina, we saw it in my state in Yakima County on the east side. Unfortunately, they've been Republican campaigns, but whatever, we're not going to get political here. You guys are a tough room. Right. Well, I'm just trying to point out a risk that I don't think most of you have thought through yet, because it's very easy. And my suggestion to you is give them other alternatives. Hand them a stamp to put on their ballots. Give them a list of local drop boxes near their residence. Have that on your webpage. Have that connection to your Secretary of State or your local election office that has the easy places they can drop off their ballots. Help be a trusted source of information to help the voter get that ballot back. But I really, really discourage you from taking people's ballots unless you are a family member or a person that lives in the same household, because some states have very, very big laws against it. My state has a law against it, but we have drop boxes, so I don't know how you possibly could manage it or prove it. But, you know, just with the mistrust that came out of 2020 from, unfortunately, the base of my party, it's just growing. And they are throwing gasoline on the fire with stories that are completely false narratives, but they believe it. And it's starting to circulate. And I can tell you at the top of their list, beyond election officials rigged the election, which, by the way, we didn't, the second thing is ballot harvesting. And you're going to be the target. All of your campaigns are going to be the target for that. And I'm telling you, it will not be worth whatever ballots you picked up and put in those drop boxes.
I think you raise an excellent point, and I strongly urge the Democrats in Montana to heed your advice and to no longer conduct ballot harvesting. Would be tremendously appreciated. But you do go to another point, regardless if people feel, you know, if there are actual experiences of fraud or malfeasance, the chain of custody for the ballot, the reason we have that process there is for a very important reason. I mean, and, you know, I make light with the election administrator's prayer, but the truth is elections are messy. They're not infallible with the process, and you need to have as many safeguards as possible to make certain that there is trust. And it kind of goes without saying, if somebody is going door to door and taking people's ballots, there is opportunity for both intentional and unintentional problems that lead to mistrust or problems or errors that shouldn't otherwise occur. You know, in Montana, you know, we tried there was a ballot initiative that passed overwhelmingly 2/3 of the vote to ban ballot harvesting. Our friends across the aisle went to court once they knew they had a competitive Senate race, had that voter-passed initiative and law overturned, and we were in a situation where, you know, if you can't beat them, join them. So that, well, we need to train our folks to make this a part of what we do. We shouldn't inherently, when most people are receiving, Republicans and Democrats receiving their ballots early, we shouldn't be necessarily losing the early vote. Our people aren't less decided, they're not less committed. In fact, in that particular election, we knew the opposite was true. So why don't we make certain that we gather the harvest and put it in the bin early? But our people wouldn't let go of their ballots. I mean, we quickly just let go of decided it was a waste of time. And honestly, when you added to the very limited success, the invitation for problems and mistakes, you know, we abandoned that course for the reasons that, you know, you suggested.
I don't have much more to add that hasn't been said, but I think it's important to think about the goal is to drive ballots to the ballot box, right? Is to get your voters to vote, and there are other ways, right? And every campaign needs to be thinking about educating their voters on how to return their ballot, how to, you know, whether, you know, luckily now most of California is prepaid postage, but that it's not in some places is terrifying. But, you know, do they have to, you know, it's county by county, so do they have to have postage? When does it have to be returned? Where are the ballot drop boxes? You know, how do you sign the back of the envelope, right? We do a ton of that on digital and mail and in person, right? The benefit of knocking on someone's door when they have a live ballot is, even if you're not harvesting it, is you can answer their questions, right? You can say, do you have your ballot? Have you filled it out? Do you have questions? In counties in California, if you don't get your ballot, you can just text the registrar and get a new one. You know, I think it's gotta be an element of your campaign is not just getting your voters to vote, but teaching them how to vote and making it as easy for them as possible.
Great point. Josh, do you have anything to add here?
I have no advice on how to follow the law. I'm not a lawyer. I'll say that I'm on the board of Lucha, an organization in Arizona. Folks here may be aware of them. Tremendous group in terms of turning out the vote. In the past, we could collect 5 ballots and drop them off. We can't anymore. But all of our folks are, you know, now trained to walk the person to the mailbox, right? Walk them, make it an experience, make it a journey for them. Walk them to the mailbox and drop it off. But to what Jill just said in terms of your get out the vote teams should be, you know, part of your script should be how to make sure the ballot is signed, when to make sure the ballot is dropped off. And, you know, we're doing all this mail right now in Virginia in Turnout, which is we're spending a tremendous amount of time figuring out exactly what ballot boxes, where they're located, what the date they need to be turned in on to get this on there. So I'm not a lawyer, no advice in that regard, but I just know what we've done in the past in Arizona, which is train them to walk them to the ballot box, make it a journey for them.
Got it. So we are almost out of time. Thank you so much. But I do want, before we depart, and I hope this conversation was enlightening and informative, and that there's a lot to think about, because this is, again, the rules of the game are the rules of the game in every jurisdiction, and you have to learn how to play by them. But parting words, one piece of advice for the practitioners in the room of, what do you want them to take away as they, engage in vote by mail campaigns?
I just think know your state, whatever state you're operating in, really take time in the very first part of your campaign to know the laws, and you're the trusted source, certainly with your supporters and your candidate supporters or your issue supporters. So be that trusted source and be that source of education, because I guarantee you that's going to help you get out the vote. It's one thing to let people know that an election's coming up. It's a totally different thing to say, did you know that your ballot has to be received by the county by 8 o'clock election night, or it won't be counted. Whatever it is, the law of the state you're operating in, know it and really weave that into your get out the vote messaging and all of your campaign work, because it's going to serve you well in helping your voters be successful in having their ballot counted.
Reevaluate your resource allocations, and I think you mentioned the most important point is, in this world, data matters so much more, and I think people underinvest in the data side of this to prepare for what sort of campaign you need to run when you have everyone voting over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I hope that people see it as an opportunity. Like, it's exciting, right? It's maybe that's just the California person in me, but having come from New York, where, I worked in campaigns in New York City, you had to have a reason to vote, absentee, and I was always working on election day, so I just didn't vote, to having this opportunity. But from a campaign tactics perspective, it opens up a whole new world of ways that you can make your tactics work together. Like, how does the data work with your texting program, works with your phone program and your messaging and your mail, and it's a really exciting opportunity. So I would encourage people to see it as that, and not so much a burden.
This is all great advice. So the only piece I would add is, and I guess it's a little different as sort of like a data person, right, is also still trust your field team. Trust those folks at the doors every single day. Don't trust them when they say 70% are ones and they're voting for us, 70% are not voting for you. But the interactions you're having, right, what issues they're raising, what they're talking about, what they're struggling with, still trust your field teams. Sitting in my home office in Phoenix, I'm not at those doors every single day, but the interactions you're having around the questions they're raising, the issues they're raising, really, really important for us to figure out how to continue to up the energy and get these ballots turned in early. So still trust your field teams.
Great. Join me in giving a round of applause to our wonderful panel. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Next is the Democrat and Republican caucus sessions. Find your way to the right room based on your political party. There's no spies here. It's not that Vegas. And then join us tonight for the Hall of Fame and Campaign Excellence Awards. Thank you, everyone.